All right, as we said before the break, countries that are home to 4 billion people, half the world, are set to cast ballots in elections this calendar year. To help break down some of the most consequential races, I'm joined by Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, whose winter issue is focused entirely on this very issue. It's called The Year the World Votes. Joining us also, Ishaan Tharoor. He's a foreign affairs columnist at the Washington Post and the author of today's Worldview newsletter. One of Ishaan's latest columns is on this exact issue, elections to watch in 2024 with global democracy on the ballot. Guys, good to see you. Thank you both for being with us. Ishaan, let me just start with you, because there's a refrain that President Biden uses a lot in his speeches. He's certainly on the right side of democracy, but he keeps on saying that democracy is succeeding and authoritarianism is failing around the world. It's actually not really true.
That's right. We're far past the age when you could confidently say that freedom is expanding, history has ended, liberal democracy is the final state of our governments. We're well beyond that. And what a host of organizations, political scientists, think tanks have been charting for the last decade is a pretty consistent retreat of democracy and the quality of democracy around the world. You're seeing Freedom House, for example, here in Washington, has charted 17 years of democratic recession. Another major group in Sweden recently pointed to 6 consecutive years of democratic decline in the quality of democracies elsewhere. And we're really seeing, and what these elections this year may show, is the fact that the dominant spirit of the age is illiberalism, not liberalism.
Ravi, this concept of the quality of democracy is important. I pointed out Russia. I pointed out Iran. Both of them have elections, but there's a quality of democracy problem therein. Timothy Snyder at Yale points out that often when countries move away from democracy in the way that the Freedom Index shows that the United States has dropped, it's not in a revolution. It's not a coup. It's not somebody overtaking the democratic government. It's people actually giving up their rights slowly, often through voting.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think people tend to conflate just the pure act of voting with democracy. Yep. And so even though we have in 2024 more people voting than in any other year in the history of the world, as Ishaan just pointed out, this is also a year where democracy has declined in quality for the 17th consecutive year. And part of the sort of challenge here is to understand why people seem to be giving up certain rights that they had, whether it is press freedom, whether it is the independence of the judiciary, whether it is a rampant nationalism, why people in elections around the world again and again seem to be voting for people who are more illiberal than liberal. And part of that could be because of a certain trend we've now seen over the last couple of decades where leaders are more and more skeptical about globalization. Leaders are increasingly trying to hone in on nationalism and what it means to be a member of a nation, what it means to define who are we. How do we define ourselves, whether it's through memory or history? And you put all of this together, whether it is India, whether it is Bangladesh, countries where you have actually, in fact, leaders who are immensely popular. If you look at many of the countries around the world where incumbents are coming up for election, some of them are slated to come back to power in part because they've been able to use the levers of the state to their advantage, whether it is bending the judiciary to their will, whether it is controlling the media and putting in place ownership structures of media organizations that end up leaning towards them. All of that put together, as well as the fact that you also have in some countries a tyranny of the majority, leads to the point that we're discussing right now, which is that you have elections, but not necessarily a better quality of democracy.
Right. And Ishaan, some of these elections are more influential than others. Like we definitely say that if America retreats further from democracy, it has influences on other places in the world. One of them I'm looking at is Taiwan. Taiwan's not voting on its own independence. It's widely believed amongst the Taiwanese that they'd like their independence from China. But the result of that election could further provoke an already very tense situation between China and Taiwan. There are many of us watching and wondering whether China will at some point invade Taiwan. What do you make of that?
Right. Well, Taiwan is curious and deeply important. It also kind of bucks the trend that we're talking about more broadly about illiberalism and nationalist governments elsewhere. You do have in Taiwan an incumbent party, the DPP, that is nominally, theoretically pro-independence, that certainly irks Beijing than some of its own domestic political rivals. And the return of the DPP in Taiwan will be perhaps interpreted by Beijing as a signal for the need for a greater kind of escalation and a greater ratcheting up of tensions, because the prospect of any kind of reconciliation, reunification, whatever it is that Beijing says it wants over the future of this island is very, very remote under a DPP government.
Ravi, I think you might be I might be talking to you from India. I never know these days where anybody is. India, the literally biggest democracy in the world, is a perfect example. It's got the vote. It's a democracy. The majority will elect the person they want to elect. But very much like Hungary, very much like potentially what happens in the United States, it is getting increasingly illiberal.
That's exactly right. And you're right. I am in Calcutta in India this week. So this is a country that is going to have elections spread out over 5 weeks. Every time India goes to polls, it is the biggest election in the history of the world, purely because of the size of the Indian population. And Narendra Modi, the prime minister, is immensely popular. However much the West might criticize his style of leadership, the fact that he's a strongman, the fact that human rights and minority rights in particular have suffered under his leadership, the fact remains that this is, in fact, what most Indians tend to want. They see Modi as an embodiment of a strongman leader that, is finally allowing for, Hindus to have their way in the world. And part of this also is a narrative that has continued in India over Modi's last 2 terms, but even further back, of Hindus having been hard done by centuries of first Muslim rule through Mughals and then British rule. But again, part of the myth-making of Modi and part of the myth-making of nationalism is this sense of us versus them, which Modi's party is very effective at creating, and they're very effective at using social media to their advantage to try and make very clear to the people that they're on their side. They're on the side of a majority of Indians, which is, more than 80% are Hindus. But it must be pointed out as well that India's economy has done very well under Modi. And in as much as regular people think about things like democracy and human rights, the economy tends to be the thing that ends up deciding many of these elections that we're discussing this year.
Which actually, Ishaan, is a thing that's going to work against the ruling party in South Africa. This is a party that since independence, philosophically, the majority of South Africans supported the ANC and its liberation movement that led to the end of apartheid. But the economy's not getting better for a whole lot of people there, and the ANC, for the first time in a long time, is in real trouble.
Yes, potentially. And you're seeing the possibility that a party that essentially draws its origins from the previous apartheid era, this kind of white-led Democratic Party, may come into power with a coalition. That at this point still is not very clear. It's going to be a close race, but the ANC, you never really count against them. But absolutely, as you said, concerns over the economy, over crime, over sort of the very sclerotic status quo that defines South Africa all these decades, are really coming to a boil. And, I think you see this more broadly around the world. Opinion polls show that, especially even and quite worryingly among younger voters, there's far less idealism about what a democratic system represents and can be, and far more impatience and frustration with perceived fecklessness, corruption of the political classes, the impunity with which they operate, and of course, the capacity of their societies and governments to deliver economically to them.
Guys, thanks very much. This is a conversation we could be having for hours, and unfortunately, we probably will cumulatively have to have this conversation for hours over the course of this year. But I appreciate the remarkable coverage you're both giving this really, really important topic, and I encourage my viewers to follow you and read your material. Ravi Agrawal is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and Ishaan Tharoor is a foreign affairs columnist at The Washington Post. Before we move on, I just want to issue a correction. In the previous segment,